In the sweltering heat of 1915 Louisiana, along the winding bayous and beneath the heavy canopy of cypress trees, there lay a plantation whose name whispered through the region with both reverence and fear. The Duval estate, a sprawling remnant of antebellum grandeur, had fallen into a peculiar darkness. Visitors and locals alike reported an unease that clung to the very air, a sensation that something unseen observed every step, every breath taken upon the moss-draped grounds. The mansion itself, with its peeling shutters and weathered columns, seemed almost alive, exhaling a quiet dread that no amount of daylight could entirely dispel. It was here that the Duval family lived and perished under circumstances that defied both logic and expectation. The patriarch, Henri Duval, a man whose wealth had been inherited through generations of cotton and sugar, carried himself with the confidence of privilege. Yet even his commanding presence could not mask the subtle tension in his household. His wife, Claudine, was known for her delicate health and nervous disposition, often wandering the estate gardens at dawn, speaking softly to shadows only she seemed to notice. Their children, 3 in number, were pale and somber, moving through hallways with an almost ritualistic rhythm that mirrored the faint, constant ticking of the mansion's grand clock. Outsiders rarely saw them. Yet when they did, a sense of wrongness lingered, a quiet, inexplicable fear that settled into the bones. The first peculiar occurrences were subtle. Guests noted the persistence of mildew in rooms that had been freshly cleaned, and the faint scent of decay that seemed to linger even after open windows and thorough airing. Servants whispered of rooms that would change overnight, doors ajar where they had been shut, furniture slightly displaced, and on rare nights, faint tapping against walls when no wind blew. Henri, ever pragmatic, dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, the result of stress or the oppressive Louisiana humidity. Yet the unease persisted, becoming a shadow that grew heavier with each passing month. By midsummer, the incidents escalated. A gardener fell ill after tending the ornamental fountains, claiming that he had seen Claudine speaking to a figure that moved like smoke, vanishing whenever he approached. One of the children reportedly disappeared into the attic for hours, returning with hands blackened and blistered, unable to explain where they had been. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, some refusing to cross the bayou entirely, claiming the estate radiated a chill that no southern sun could warm. Local newspapers began to carry cautious reports, describing the cursed Duval estate and hinting at a strange pattern. Each head of the family seemed doomed to die young, often under sudden, unexplained circumstances. As summer waned into autumn, the tension reached its peak with the arrival of a distant cousin, Gaston Leclerc, whose curiosity brought him from New Orleans. He was greeted with the veneer of genteel hospitality, yet within hours he reported a sensation of oppressive surveillance, as though the house itself breathed around him. Hallways seemed to lengthen unexpectedly, shadows pooled unnaturally beneath chandeliers, and whispers echoed from the corners of rooms where no one stood. In one instance, Gaston claimed to witness Henri abruptly collapse mid-conversation, clutching his chest, only to be revived hours later by an unknown combination of herbs and chanting by Claudine. Even to the most skeptical, it was clear that the plantation operated under rules of its own, inscrutable and relentless. The story of the Duval estate is not simply one of fear. It is a story of lineage, inheritance, and the uncanny way in which wealth and isolation can shape human behavior. The family's history stretches back to the earliest days of Louisiana's plantation economy, a time when slavery, superstition, and social hierarchy intertwined with the land itself. These elements, combined with the oppressive heat, swarming mosquitoes, and the bayou's eternal fog, created conditions where physical illness, psychological strain, and spiritual anxiety could converge with terrifying effect. In this crucible, the Duval family became both the observer and the observed, participants in a drama that would culminate in death, disappearance, and whispered legend. Even the local clergy were unsettled. Priests visiting the estate for Sunday prayers reported that the air seemed thick with something beyond mortal comprehension, and that candles would flicker violently in otherwise still rooms. One noted the children moving through the pews with uncanny silence, as though they were both present and apart, carrying knowledge of some hidden truth that no sermon could address. The servants, meanwhile, alternated between obedience and fear, following instructions meticulously yet speaking of the strange chanting that sometimes echoed from the attic, and of the scent of smoke and iron that no hearth could explain. It is here, in the quiet desperation of a house that had seen more wealth than most could imagine, that the story of Henri, Claudine, and their children begins. The Duval estate is not remembered merely for its architectural beauty or its sprawling acres, but for the subtle, creeping darkness that seemed to claim those who dwelled there. Their lives, their deaths, and the rituals that intertwined the two became a subject of fascination, fear, and ultimately, speculation that persists over a century later. By the time night fell on the plantation, the house was alive with a tension that seemed almost deliberate. Shadows lengthened, floorboards groaned under invisible weight, and the faint sound of crying, or was it chanting, echoed across the bayou. It was in this atmosphere, charged with both history and unexplainable phenomena, that the Duval family lived and died. And it is here that our story begins, a tale not merely of a cursed plantation, but of a lineage caught between wealth, superstition, and the silent terror that only isolation and history can produce. Louisiana in the early 20th century was a state still defined by the echoes of its antebellum past. The Duval plantation sat along the bayous, a remnant of the vast wealth generated by sugar and cotton, industries built upon the forced labor of enslaved people, and the rigid social hierarchy that followed. Though slavery had been abolished half a century prior, its legacy lingered in every brick of the mansion, every levee dug along the bayou, and in the relationships between families who had once been masters and those who had been subjugated. The social structure of the region remained sharply stratified, and even minor deviations from expected behavior were noted, whispered about, and sometimes feared. The Duvals themselves were descendants of French Creole nobility, their wealth stretching back to the 18th century. They inherited both property and social expectations, carrying a reputation that demanded public respect and private adherence to family ritual. Bayou communities were small and interconnected, yet intensely watchful of outsiders, and the Duvals were no exception. Servants, sharecroppers, and laborers all understood that life on the plantation operated under a code that was strict, sometimes unspoken, and often enforced through observation and subtle intimidation. Isolation was both a choice and a necessity, allowing the family to maintain control over the estate while keeping prying eyes at bay. Daily life on the plantation reflected a delicate balance of wealth and survival. The Duval family oversaw extensive fields, employing dozens of workers to maintain sugarcane crops and livestock. The labor was grueling, the Louisiana heat oppressive, and disease a constant threat. Yellow fever and malaria were endemic, and local medical care was limited. Families like the Duvals, though wealthy, were not immune. Sudden deaths from fevers, infections, or environmental hazards were common. Such vulnerabilities fed both fear and superstition. Stories circulated among workers that the land itself was cursed, that the Duvals' wealth and isolation had drawn some unseen misfortune, a belief that would only intensify as more unexplained deaths occurred. Education and refinement were central to the Duval identity. The children were taught French, Latin, and the arts, while also being schooled in plantation management. Tutors, often brought from New Orleans or even Europe, were employed to maintain the family's cultural standing. Yet these lessons often occurred within the imposing walls of the mansion, where shadows lengthened in corners, and the children's movements were quietly observed by both parents and servants. Scholars later hypothesized that such an environment, privileged yet insular, cultivated yet isolated, could create conditions conducive to obsessive, ritualized behavior. The combination of inherited expectations, wealth, and a closed social environment created a pressure cooker, atmosphere that few could navigate without developing habits and beliefs markedly different from those outside the estate. Social gatherings were carefully orchestrated events, a way to demonstrate the Duvals' prominence and reinforce alliances with neighboring families. Balls, dinners, and Sunday prayers offered appearances of normalcy, yet even in these moments of public display, subtle signs hinted at the estate's darker rhythms. Guests occasionally noted a strange solemnity in the children's eyes, or the slightly off-key cadence of the family's movements as they served or entertained. Servants whispered among themselves, suggesting that the family observed invisible rules or maintained secrets that outsiders could not perceive. The plantation, in essence, was both a stage and a cage, its grandeur masking tensions and mysteries that ran deeper than anyone could articulate. The physical environment itself contributed to the estate's eerie character. Bayous twisted like veins through the land, dense cypress swamps cast deep shadows even at midday, and thick fog frequently rolled in from the water, obscuring paths and muffling sound. Hurricanes and tropical storms were a constant threat, yet the mansion endured, its weathered walls absorbing each tempest and standing as a symbol of both resilience and isolation. Locals often remarked that the Duval property seemed removed from time. Even in periods of relative peace, the house emitted a presence that suggested a history of accumulated observation, of secrets and rituals carefully maintained. Scientific and medical understanding at the time was limited. Diseases such as typhoid, influenza, and tuberculosis were poorly understood, and the general population often turned to folk remedies or superstition when conventional medicine failed. This cultural context influenced how both locals and the Duvals interpreted illness and sudden death. A fever might be blamed on cursed land, a disrupted ritual or spiritual imbalance rather than bacterial infection. Psychological phenomena were similarly poorly understood. Obsessive behavior, compulsive rituals, or extreme fear responses were often interpreted as signs of moral weakness or supernatural influence. In this environment, the lines between rational explanation and folklore blurred, creating fertile ground for the stories that would later surround the plantation. Economically, the early 1900s were a period of both prosperity and instability. Sugar prices fluctuated, labor disputes occasionally erupted, and the mechanization of agriculture began to challenge traditional labor models. Plantations like the Duvals operated in relative self-sufficiency, producing not only sugar and cotton but also livestock, timber, and various crops for household use. Wealth insulated the family to some degree, but it also reinforced the pressure to maintain appearances and uphold a lineage of success. The juxtaposition of economic power and environmental vulnerability amplified both fear and superstition, as even the privileged were subject to the unpredictability of nature and health. Religion played a subtle but pervasive role. Catholicism, with its rituals and sacraments, permeated daily life, while folk beliefs and superstitions infused local culture. Family chapels and small shrines dotted the estate, and private prayers were common among both family and servants. Scholars have suggested that this blending of structured faith and local superstition may have contributed to the Duvals' ritualistic practices, providing both a moral framework and a symbolic language through which fear, control, and familial expectation were expressed. The constant presence of religious and cultural symbolism reinforced the impression that the household operated according to its own rules, with consequences for those who strayed. Finally, the social isolation of the Duvals cannot be overstated. The estate's size, coupled with the surrounding swamps and the community's wariness, allowed the family to maintain control over every interaction. Outsiders were monitored, sometimes welcomed, often feared, and rarely allowed to penetrate the deeper rhythms of daily life. This isolation created conditions under which unusual behaviors could flourish unchecked, rituals could intensify, and patterns of tragedy could repeat without interruption. The estate was a microcosm, a self-contained world in which history, geography, social expectation, and human psychology converged to produce a story that was both historically grounded and hauntingly uncanny. Understanding the Duval plantation, then, requires more than a focus on superstition or anecdote. It is a story of geography, economics, culture, and inherited expectation. The swampy Louisiana terrain, the weight of history, the isolation of wealth, and the limits of contemporary medical knowledge all intersected to create an environment where tragedy, fear, and ritual could flourish. It is in this context that the lives of Henri, Claudine, and their children must be understood not merely as a family cursed, but as participants in a world where the pressures of inheritance, environment, and social expectation shaped every action, every fear, and every untimely death. The first major incident that drew widespread attention occurred one humid July morning when Henri Duval was found unconscious near the sugarcane fields. He had been inspecting the crop with a foreman, yet no one could identify a cause. His face was pale, sweat beading along his temples, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. Local doctors were summoned, but their treatments were largely ineffective. Observers noted an unusual symptom. Henri's pulse was irregular, yet his consciousness seemed intermittently alert, as though part of him remained aware while the rest was incapacitated. Whispers spread that some unseen force had claimed him temporarily, and the incident became the first in a series of mysterious medical crises that would come to define the estate. Not long after, Claudine herself fell ill under equally strange circumstances. While attending to household chores, she collapsed on the kitchen floor, claiming she had felt an invisible weight pressing against her chest. Servants attempted to lift her, but she resisted, speaking of shadows moving along the walls and strange murmurs in the corners. Neighbors who came to assist were unnerved by the sight. Claudine's lips were pale, eyes wide, yet her breathing was shallow and rhythmic, almost ritualistic in its cadence. By the time the physician arrived, the symptoms had subsided as suddenly as they appeared, leaving no physiological explanation. Discussions among doctors and clergy oscillated between possible poisoning, nervous collapse, or the influence of local superstition manifesting physically. The children became involved in their own series of disturbing events. One morning, the youngest was found atop the attic rafters, perched as if surveying the entire house. The child had climbed without assistance, leaving marks on walls and floors that puzzled even the most experienced servants. When questioned, the child spoke of being called by an invisible presence, insisting that they were watching, that the estate itself had eyes. Though some dismissed it as imagination, repeated incidents, doors opening and closing, faint scratching sounds at night, objects displaced suggested a pattern that no ordinary explanation could satisfy. Fear and fascination intertwined, leaving both family and staff in a state of constant vigilance. The estate's livestock also became victims of inexplicable misfortune. Horses were found collapsed in stables with no clear cause, and chickens and pigs sometimes perished suddenly, their bodies contorted in ways that suggested violent struggle. Farmhands speculated on disease or toxins, yet each investigation yielded little evidence. One incident involved a prized horse, found impaled on a broken fence post in the central field. The animal had not struggled visibly, yet the placement of the body and the absence of blood raised questions. Servants whispered that the family's rituals might extend beyond themselves, affecting both living creatures and the land itself. As weeks progressed, accidents within the mansion increased. A footman slipped on polished stairs, sustaining severe lacerations. The injury was complicated by rapid swelling and infection, defying standard treatment. Another incident involved a knife falling from a kitchen shelf, narrowly missing a maid but leaving deep gouges in the floor. Each event carried a weight of significance beyond its immediate physical harm. Locals began to see patterns where ordinary accidents coincided with the family's private rituals or moments of heightened tension. The estate seemed to impose a rhythm on daily life, a combination of misfortune and meticulous orchestration that heightened anxiety for everyone involved. Visitors from nearby parishes were not immune. Gaston Leclerc, the cousin from New Orleans, experienced a particularly unnerving episode while exploring the grounds. He reported sudden dizziness, nausea, and the sensation of multiple presences watching him. At one point, he saw a shadow move across the lawn, though no person was present. He stumbled, cutting his hand on a wrought iron fence, and fainted soon after. When revived, he insisted he had felt compelled to follow an invisible path across the property, as if drawn by forces beyond comprehension. His account added to the growing local consensus that the estate was not merely a house, but a domain with its own will. Fires, too, became part of the series of incidents. A small outbuilding caught flame without an apparent source, consuming hay, tools, and minor livestock. Though quickly extinguished, the fire's sudden appearance alarmed both servants and neighbors. Some claimed to hear whispers in the night preceding the blaze, a chant-like sound that seemed to emanate from the heart of the mansion itself. The conflagration, though minor in scale, reinforced the idea that the Duval estate was under the influence of forces beyond conventional understanding, whether natural, human, or supernatural remained a subject of debate. Illnesses continued to strike the family with alarming regularity. Henri's health, never robust, deteriorated further after a sudden collapse while inspecting the levees along the bayou. Claudine reported chest pains and dizziness in near-identical patterns. Their children displayed unexplained fevers and sudden fainting spells. Physicians, constrained by contemporary medical knowledge, struggled to provide consistent care. Treatments ranged from herbal tonics to restricted diets, yet no intervention could reliably prevent recurrence. Some local healers and clergy suggested spiritual remedies, invoking protective prayers and charms, but results were inconsistent, further blurring the line between medical, environmental, and mystical causes. Neighbors and visitors noted the psychological impact of these repeated incidents. Servants grew wary, often hesitant to enter certain rooms alone. Outsiders reported a sense of unease upon approaching the estate, citing an oppressive air that seemed to weigh on the mind and body. Some scholars have later described this as a form of collective psychosomatic response, a feedback loop where fear and expectation created real physical and behavioral reactions. Others maintained that a combination of hereditary illness, environmental factors such as swamp-borne pathogens, and extreme isolation contributed to the pattern of tragedy that haunted the Duvals. By late autumn, the series of incidents escalated further. A carpenter fell from scaffolding while repairing the mansion's roof, sustaining injuries that would prove fatal in weeks despite medical care. The youngest child was discovered wandering near the bayou at night, drawn by a mysterious light across the water. Henri himself suffered a sudden, severe cardiac event, narrowly surviving despite immediate intervention. Each event was recorded meticulously by family scribes and local physicians, creating a detailed chronology that would later fascinate historians and folklorists alike. The cumulative effect of these incidents created an atmosphere of both terror and fascination. Locals began referring to the estate as cursed, while visitors spoke of it as a living monument to inexplicable misfortune. Every fall, burn, or collapse was imbued with symbolic weight. Accidents became omens, injuries became signs, and the plantation itself became a character in the unfolding drama. To outsiders, the Duval family's plight was simultaneously horrifying and irresistible, a study in how isolation, heredity, and environmental stress could intertwine to produce a sequence of events that defied conventional understanding. Even routine activities carried danger. A simple meal in the kitchen could result in burns or cuts from otherwise mundane utensils. Hallways seemed to conspire against movement, with stairs and floorboards contributing to slips and injuries. Medical professionals observed that the intensity and frequency of accidents suggested both physical and psychological stressors, yet they remained unable to explain the patterns fully. The line between coincidence and pattern became increasingly blurred, reinforcing the aura of inevitability that surrounded the Duval family. By the end of the year, the plantation had become a locus of unease for the entire region. Mail carriers, traders, and neighboring farmers avoided the main house, while folklore and rumor amplified the narrative of the cursed estate. Every incident, from minor injury to sudden illness, was scrutinized for signs of connection to the family's private rituals. Observers, historians, and medical experts would later describe this period as a convergence of misfortune, environment, heredity, and social isolation, producing a dark tableau in which ordinary life became inseparable from extraordinary terror. The Duval family's series of misfortunes did not remain private for long. Word traveled swiftly through the parishes surrounding the plantation, carried by neighbors, itinerant merchants, and local clergy. Accounts varied, blending observation, rumor, and speculation, yet all agreed on a common thread. The Duvals were in the grip of something extraordinary, something that ordinary explanations could not encompass. Families who had once interacted casually with the Duvals began to distance themselves, concerned not only for their own safety but also for the social stigma attached to proximity with a household so frequently. Afflicted clergy who visited the estate were among the first to articulate concern in official correspondence. Priests noted a pervasive tension within the household, an atmosphere in which prayer, ritual, and fear seemed to coalesce. Letters to diocesan authorities described the children's peculiar movements, the adults' repeated illnesses, and the unsettling quiet that often accompanied ordinary moments. Some clergy suggested that the family was under spiritual duress, possibly influenced by lingering superstition or inherited anxiety. Others proposed that the behaviors reflected psychological strain, the result of isolation and the pressure to uphold family reputation. The letters reveal a nuanced awareness that both spiritual and scientific explanations were incomplete, leaving room for conjecture and unease. Local physicians were equally confounded. Dr. Pierre Marchand, one of the first to attend to Henri Duval following his collapse in the fields, meticulously recorded symptoms that defied conventional understanding: intermittent consciousness, sudden fainting spells, and rapid physical deterioration without identifiable cause. Treatments were standard for the era: herbal tonics, leeches, and restricted diets, but often proved ineffectual. Physicians noted the repeated pattern of young deaths within the family, the alignment of illness with environmental and psychological stressors, and the recurrence of unusual accidents within the mansion. In private correspondence, some speculated on hereditary disease, while others considered environmental factors such as swamp-borne pathogens or toxins. Publicly, they reported cautiously, aware that fear and superstition could easily escalate into panic. The servants' reactions were complex. Bound by employment, loyalty, and social obligation, they simultaneously feared the house and sought to maintain its operations. Many reported sleeping lightly, alert to creaks, whispers, and fleeting shadows. Tasks were completed with precision, yet always under a layer of tension. Some servants began to attribute the series of accidents and illnesses to curses or the will of the land itself, blending folklore with the very real observation of repeated misfortune. Their accounts, recorded years later in letters and diaries, reveal a profound awareness of the psychological weight carried by the family and those in their immediate orbit. Neighbors' perspectives ranged from cautious curiosity to outright fear. Farmers, traders, and visitors noted the peculiar rhythm of the estate's life: the abrupt illnesses, the sudden fires, the children wandering in the dead of night. Rumors spread rapidly, with each retelling amplifying the sense of the estate as a locus of misfortune. Some neighbors avoided the property entirely, describing an oppressive atmosphere as they approached. Others, braver or perhaps more skeptical, visited and returned with accounts of subtle anomalies: furniture slightly moved, shadows that seemed to follow, and a pervasive chill that lingered despite the Louisiana heat. These accounts reinforced the growing reputation of the Duval plantation as cursed or haunted, embedding it firmly in regional folklore. Local newspapers were quick to document the events, though editorial caution tempered sensationalism. The Baton Rouge Advocate published a short piece noting the repeated illnesses and sudden deaths among the Duvals, emphasizing the family's prominence while hinting at strange occurrences. Reports oscillated between medical observation, human interest, and subtle suggestion of the uncanny. Readers were captivated. Letters to editors expressed shock, fear, and fascination. Other regional publications followed suit, each retelling the incidents with slight embellishment, contributing to the legend of the cursed estate while maintaining journalistic distance. Psychologists and social historians later analyzed these reactions as part of a broader pattern of collective anxiety. Isolation, wealth, and social expectation created conditions in which both the Duvals and the wider community could experience amplified responses to ordinary stressors. Fear of disease, hereditary illness, and sudden death intersected with superstition and folklore, creating a feedback loop in which perception itself shaped reality. Scholars note that this combination, real misfortune heightened by communal interpretation, produced narratives that were both compelling and terrifying, a phenomenon echoed in many historical accounts of isolated, prominent families. Letters from clergy, physicians, and neighbors reveal attempts at intervention and guidance. Priests offered additional prayers and blessings, suggesting that spiritual protection might mitigate the family's misfortunes. Doctors recommended relocation or environmental adjustment, often without success. Neighbors attempted minor interventions, such as assisting with tasks that carried risk, yet were consistently met with resistance or unexplainable outcomes. These efforts highlight the complexity of the situation. The estate operated on both practical and symbolic levels, where interventions could be ineffective, not only because of the family's health, but because of the psychological and ritualistic structure that governed daily life. Family members themselves reacted in ways that combined pragmatism with ritualized response. Claudine developed careful routines designed to minimize accidents and illness, incorporating prayer, diet, and environmental observation. Henri meticulously documented each event, consulting with physicians, yet simultaneously adhering to inherited beliefs and symbolic gestures meant to preserve family well-being. The children, increasingly aware of the house's rhythms and expectations, participated in these routines with quiet precision. Outsiders often interpreted these behaviors as eccentric or obsessive, While modern analysis suggests a combination of coping strategy, learned behavior, and subtle reinforcement of family hierarchy and tradition. By late 1915, the estate had become a focal point of fascination, dread, and speculation. Social commentary reflected broader anxieties of the time: vulnerability to disease, the persistence of superstition, and the challenges of maintaining wealth and status in a changing world. The Duval family, caught at the intersection of these forces, became emblematic of the region's struggle between modernity and tradition, science and folklore, observation and fear. Public, private, and scholarly accounts collectively documented a pattern of events that was both statistically unusual and culturally meaningful, reinforcing the perception of a cursed lineage and a haunted plantation. Ultimately, the reactions of society neighbors, clergy, physicians, journalists, and servants illustrate how human communities interpret repeated misfortune, particularly when combined with isolation, wealth, and ritual. The Duvals' story became both a medical curiosity and a folkloric cautionary tale, one that highlighted the limits of contemporary understanding while embedding the estate firmly in the cultural imagination. It was a narrative in which observation, fear, and interpretation intertwined, producing a legacy that would linger long after the family's immediate crises had passed, shaping local memory and scholarly discourse alike. The night arrived with a heavy fog that rolled across the bayou, thickening the air until the mansion seemed to float on a river of mist. Henri Duval had retired to his study, a dimly lit room filled with ledgers, old medical notes, and family records. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed like a drumbeat, punctuating the tension that had been building for months. Outside, the cypress trees swayed in a windless breeze, casting jagged shadows against the peeling shutters. Something unnameable seemed to stir within the house, a presence both unseen and undeniable, pressing against the walls and seeping into the corridors. Claudine wandered from room to room, tending candles and murmuring prayers, her voice low and quivering. Her hands trembled as she arranged protective charms, small tokens she believed would shield the family from the unseen forces that had haunted them. The children followed silently, moving with the deliberate caution that had been drilled into them since infancy. Their eyes, pale and watchful, reflected the candlelight, and every creak of the floorboards caused them to flinch. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the outlines of the bayou and erasing any sense of orientation. The plantation was isolated more than ever, a world unto itself, suspended between night and dread. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the attic. A servant rushed up to investigate, only to return minutes later, pale and shaken. He reported seeing furniture topple as if moved by invisible hands and hearing a voice whispering in a language unknown. The children remained eerily calm, continuing their tasks with the same methodical precision they had exhibited throughout the month. Henri, now visibly agitated, attempted to maintain authority, commanding the staff to secure the house. Yet even his presence could not pierce the growing sense of inevitability, as though the estate itself resisted order and control. A storm began to rise over the bayou, distant thunder mingling with the natural chorus of frogs and cicadas. Rain tapped lightly against the shutters, yet the wind remained unnaturally still within the house. In the main hall, Claudine suddenly collapsed, clutching her chest, her lips whispering fragmented prayers. Henri rushed to her side, lifting her with an effort that belied his own fatigue. She gasped, eyes wide with terror, pointing toward the doorway where no one stood. "They are here," she whispered, voice trembling. The children echoed the words in a chorus of small, solemn voices, as if confirming a presence that no one else could perceive. The tension escalated as objects began to move on their own. Chairs slid across polished floors, candlesticks toppled, and the piano in the corner played a single, dissonant chord without human touch. Servants huddled together, unsure whether to flee or obey instructions. Outside the mansion, the fog thickened further, merging with the shadows of the forest and erasing any safe paths. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every whisper magnified. The house was alive, breathing, and reacting. A predator that had patiently waited months to manifest its influence fully. Henri attempted to rationalize, insisting that drafts, faulty beams, or panic explained the events. Yet even his logical mind could not account for what followed. A sudden crash from the kitchen signaled the breaking of glass, followed by a low, guttural sound reverberating through the hallways. The children turned as one, staring toward the source with an unnatural calm, as if reading cues invisible to adults. Henri felt a chill that penetrated his bones, a sensation of eyes upon him from every direction. Even the servants, long accustomed to tension and unease, fell silent, witnessing a force that defied explanation. Lightning illuminated the hall briefly, revealing Claudine's expression frozen in horror. She pointed toward the staircase where a shadow moved, thick and fluid, shifting impossibly between floors. Henri and the staff rushed toward it, yet found nothing. The children continued their measured movements, almost as if they had anticipated the apparition. In that instant, it became clear. The house and its inhabitants were caught in a convergence of fear, ritual, and inexplicable phenomena, each element amplifying the other in a crescendo of tension. Then came the smell, smoke tinged with iron, seeping through the hallways, thickening the air until every breath carried weight. Henri's chest tightened, his pulse racing. Claudine coughed, staggering toward the door, while the children's eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight, as if reflecting an unseen flame. The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the clock, the house itself marking time not by hours, but by dread. Servants whispered of the estate's curse, a force that could no longer be ignored, something that demanded recognition and compliance. As the night deepened, the mansion seemed to contract and expand simultaneously. Rooms appeared longer, shadows shifted unpredictably, and each step felt both real and impossible. One child vanished from the hall, only to reappear at the attic stairs, eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. Henri attempted to follow, but each turn of the corridor revealed only more shadows, more anomalies. The storm outside intensified, rain pelting windows with a deafening rhythm. Yet inside, the air remained heavy and still, charged with anticipation. By midnight, the house had transformed into a stage of chaos, every sensory detail amplified. Cries, whispers, and dissonant sounds blended into a symphony of fear. Henri, exhausted, recognized that control had slipped beyond human grasp. Claudine, now seated and trembling, traced protective symbols on the floor with hands that shook violently. The children moved silently among them, each step measured, eyes wide with a knowledge no outsider could comprehend. The estate, long a witness to generations of misfortune, had finally asserted itself fully, imposing a climax that combined environmental stress, psychological strain, and inexplicable phenomena into a night that would be remembered for decades. Dawn arrived slowly, the fog retreating to reveal a plantation subdued but not entirely calm. The family emerged from the night with exhaustion etched into every line of their faces. Servants whispered of things they could not name, and neighbors later recounted seeing flickers of light along the bayou where no flame could exist. Henri and Claudine were alive, yet changed. The children silent, watchful, as if absorbing the lessons of a night that defied reason. The storm had passed, but the imprint of fear, the awareness of forces unseen, lingered, solidifying the estate's reputation as a place where ordinary life intersected with the extraordinary. The events of that night became the focal point for local legend, a narrative of terror, endurance, and the inexplicable. Scholars, psychologists, and folklorists later described the night as a convergence of environmental, psychological, and possibly hereditary factors. Yet even the most analytical accounts could not fully account for the sensation of dread, the tangible tension, or the series of incidents that combined to form the climax of the Duval estate's dark narrative. The house, the family, and the bayou itself seemed bound together in a tableau of fear, a living testament to the perils of isolation, inherited expectation, and the thin veil separating the natural from the inexplicable. The Duval plantation did not return to ordinary life after that night. Though Henri and Claudine survived, their presence on the estate was forever marked by a tension that could not be dissolved. Visitors became rarer, and the estate's gates, once open to neighbors and tradesmen, closed more frequently, restricting access to family, servants, and occasional clergy. The fog over the bayou seemed thicker in the years that followed, and locals whispered that the land itself had absorbed the events of that night, carrying forward the residue of fear, ritual, and unexplained phenomena. The children grew under the watchful eyes of parents increasingly cautious and protective. Each seemed to inherit a sense of the estate's power, moving through rooms with quiet purpose, speaking little, yet observing all. Outsiders described them as unnervingly composed, their expressions betraying an awareness beyond their years. Medical records and family diaries from this period suggest a complex interplay between inherited stress, isolation, and environmental factors. Modern psychologists might consider these behaviors as coping mechanisms in response to chronic trauma. Yet contemporaries interpreted them as signs of the family's peculiar destiny, reinforcing the narrative of a cursed lineage. Local newspapers continued to chronicle incidents, though more cautiously. Fires, sudden illnesses, and unexplained accidents were reported in careful language, hinting at unusual circumstances without explicitly attributing them to supernatural causes. Letters to editors, diary entries, and oral histories indicate that the plantation remained a source of fascination, rumor, and fear for decades. Scholars note that the Duvals' story illustrates the interplay between fact, perception, and narrative construction. Repeated misfortune and isolation generated legends that would shape regional memory far beyond the immediate facts. Physicians continued to debate potential causes of the family's repeated health crises. Some hypothesized hereditary cardiac or neurological disorders, compounded by the stress of isolation and environmental hazards, such as swamp-borne pathogens or contaminated water. Others considered psychosomatic effects, wherein chronic anxiety and fear produced physical manifestations. Still, no definitive diagnosis could explain the full pattern of incidents, leaving both contemporary observers and later historians with a lingering sense of uncertainty. The ambiguity only deepened the aura of mystery surrounding the estate. Spiritual and folkloric interpretations persisted alongside medical speculation. Priests reported subtle disturbances during visits, candles flickering without draft, faint sounds echoing through empty rooms, and an atmosphere that suggested unseen observation. Local folklore absorbed these reports, transforming the Duval plantation into a cautionary tale of inherited misfortune, ritualized behavior, and the thin veil separating the natural from the uncanny. Some even suggested that the land itself was sentient, retaining memory of past misdeeds and influencing the fate of those who dwelled upon it. Socially, the Duval family became both admired and feared. Their wealth and prominence demanded respect, yet their peculiar history and the pattern of early deaths created an invisible barrier between them and the community. Invitations to gatherings declined, tradesmen hesitated to cross the bayou, and neighbors exchanged stories that blended observation with superstition. Scholars studying the estate later noted that this social isolation may have reinforced the family's behaviors, creating a self-perpetuating cycle in which fear, ritual, and environment interacted to maintain the narrative of the cursed plantation. By the mid-20th century, the Duval estate had entered the realm of legend. Academic studies, folklore collections, and local histories preserved accounts of the family's experiences, often blending fact with interpretation. The plantation became a case study in the convergence of hereditary risk, environmental stressors, and social isolation, demonstrating how real-world conditions could produce events that, when observed and interpreted by communities, assumed the qualities of myth. Visitors, historians, and paranormal enthusiasts alike have continued to visit, drawn by the haunting atmosphere of the foggy bayous and the enduring aura of fear that seems to cling to every remaining brick. Speculation persists about whether the unusual patterns of illness and misfortune could recur or whether they were bound to the particular combination of family, place, and circumstance. Some historians argue that the story demonstrates how wealth, isolation, and inherited expectation create vulnerabilities, both physical and psychological. Others suggest that the legend persists precisely because the events resist full explanation, leaving a space where imagination and fear can flourish. Local accounts describe fleeting glimpses of shadows, strange lights and sounds echoing from the mansion, reinforcing the impression that the estate's influence has not fully dissipated. Ultimately, the Duval plantation stands as a testament to the interplay between human behavior, environment, and narrative. The family's experiences reflect the challenges of isolation, the pressures of inherited wealth and expectation, and the limits of contemporary medicine and understanding. Yet they also reveal the power of story, how repeated misfortune, observed through the lens of fear and folklore, becomes legend, shaping both memory and cultural imagination. The estate, the bayou, and the mansion itself remain symbols of uncertainty, inviting reflection on the thin line between history and myth, the natural and the inexplicable. As night falls over the bayou, one can still sense the echoes of that fateful period. The faint rustle of leaves, the subtle shift of shadows, the lingering scent of smoke and iron. The Duval family, in life and legend, has become inseparable from the land they inhabited. Their history entwined with the rhythms of the swamp, the fog, and the mansion. Whether the estate will ever release its secrets is unknown. Whether the family's line continues to carry the weight of inherited misfortune remains a subject of speculation. What is certain is that the Duval plantation endures as a symbol of human vulnerability, resilience, and the enduring mystery of a world where history, psychology, and the unexplained converge in a dark, haunting tableau.